Welcome to another episode of Recipe to Success. I don't really have to do too much talking today because you can see this is going to be special. I'm dressed up in a suit. Don't normally do this, but this episode is really going to be about teaching you everything that you don't learn in school. So we're really going to go into like a class almost. Before we get into the video, be sure to subscribe if you're listening on YouTube, watching on YouTube, and if you're listening on Apple Music or Spotify, also subscribe. Urban Financier, how are you doing?
Very well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I know this has been a few months in the making, so I'm sorry it took me so long to get here.
For me, it was, obviously I've been following you for a couple of years now, and I really learned a lot myself, just about general things. Even sometimes doing the polls on your stories, I get them wrong, and I'm always learning from what you put out. So I really thought it'd be valuable for the audience, the young ones, but also even 25 to 34-year-olds who maybe they're trying to invest now and they want to learn. So it's going to be exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Cool. So obviously I know who you are and I've followed you for a while, but for anyone that doesn't know who you are, why don't you give us a bit of an introduction?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Urban Financier. I'm a private banker. I look after entrepreneurs based in the UK, sector agnostic. So I cover people in sectors such as food and beverage, hotels, hospitality, property development, automotive, recruitment, you name it. And it gives me a really good insight of our economy and how it works. So I'm fortunate that if I want to really get a pulse of how our economy is doing, I just talk to my clients rather than pick up, any press, because by the time it reaches, the press, it's probably been diluted a little bit, or there's been some creative enhancements added to it. So I've been doing that for the last 13 years or so. I really enjoy it. I help innovators really kind of push forward with their own personal financial objectives and goals. And being a private banker, you get to really become the fourth wall of an individual's life, because there's more than just somebody being a name in the system, but it's actually being on a first name basis with some really influential people, not necessarily people that you might notice on the TV. I can count the amount of my clients who you probably recognize, but these are very important people who perhaps employ some of the people you see on TV. But really being a trusted advisor to these individuals, helping them to reach their financial goals. So that's a bit about what I do.
Mm-hmm. So how long have you been doing it, and how did you actually get into private banking?
So over 13 years now. So my journey pretty much started like most people.
You look very young, by the way.
Thank you. I don't feel it. But my journey started off pretty much like most people in inner city London. I grew up in an area where, not that there weren't a lot of opportunities, but I think we were made to think that there were only certain ways that you could, quote unquote, make it out. And that was whether you were in sports or you were in entertainment. I mean, when I was growing up, I had no idea that a private banker existed. I didn't know anybody who worked in the financial industry, for that matter. And I think for me, it took a lot of really appreciating what I think we need as a community in order to really start stepping out and looking abroad. I mean, how about this? What if we could turn the place where we're from into the place where we want to be, rather than always trying to escape it? That was a thought that was always running through my mind, that, everyone's trying to make it out. What's wrong with the place where we're from? I get it from a social economic situation that it's probably not the best place for people trying to find opportunities. But if we all start to make the right financial decisions, we can turn it into a place where we don't have to leave. But I just got very curious. I did a lot of public speaking when I was younger. I loved English, literature, went to university. I studied a bit of social I studied communications, and I didn't really enjoy it as much as I thought I would. I thought I always wanted to end up in communications of some description, but I didn't really like that in the end, because I found that a lot of it was about opinions and what people thought. So I thought, right, okay, this was around 2008, just before the financial crisis was happening. When I got into banking, and I thought to myself, well, if the financial crisis is going to get rid of a lot of people in the financial industry, how amazing would it be for me to get into this industry which is about to crumble? And if I can survive when it recovers, then I have a pretty good standpoint. And that's exactly what I did. So I didn't have any sort of finance background, or forward thinking. At a time where everybody was basically trying to grab onto the closest thing they could find, I thought, okay, well, I'm going to jump into this industry, and if they're silly enough to still recruit whilst the industry is crumbling, then surely they're going to need people to rebuild it. And that's exactly what I did. But as you can imagine, walking into private banking or finance as a young male coming from Northwest London, I was into an environment where I was the only, for a long time, right? Whether I was the only young guy in the room or the only black guy in the room or whatever. And for me, it was a question about using everything that I had sort of stood for as a person to really drive me forward. I knew I didn't have rich parents. I didn't have the contacts or the tools to walk into those environments and command anything other than what I was able to produce myself. So those were the kind of things that I used to really sort of make me exist in the room. A lot of people kind of come up against these situations and they crumble because they let their situation go ahead of them. And there's a lot of things we can't control. I can't control where I come from. And the people around me taught me how to survive, but they didn't teach me how to really elevate as an individual. And I don't blame them for that, because we come from an era where a lot of our parents only knew how to survive. But that doesn't mean we didn't come from nothing. But that means we came from ambition, we came from passion, we came from hunger. You can't buy hunger, right? So I had all those things when I entered this industry. And that's what I used literally to propel myself. And there were people around me who were very comfortable. And what you find is that when you're in a room of people who are comfortable, you look like the odd one out when you're trying to push on, because they haven't got the same hunger as you. So when I was first into private banking, I remember walking around every day reading the Financial Times. And I wasn't an advisor when I first started. And people would say, well, why are you reading the Financial Times? You don't need it. And I thought, well, how limited are you in your thinking that you think this is all I will ever want to be? Surely if I'm in this industry, I need to know what's happening in my industry, regardless if I'm advising or I'm not advising. So I kind of turned off all those noise, because there is a lot of noise wherever you are of people who are not on the same path as you. And if you tune into those noises, it often just slows you down. So I kind of really siloed my mind and thought, right, I want to become a senior advisor, looking after individuals who are really making a difference in the world. And that was really my focus. So I just really drove down on that. And I was fortunate that when I joined the industry, I was young enough. I had no major responsibilities or liabilities. I could fully commit myself. I put my hand up for any additional work and jobs that nobody else wanted to do. And that helped me to become a more rounded individual than people who, just come into work to do their 9 to 5 and go home. And I think that, if you can demonstrate to somebody that you're capable of doing the job that they pay you to do, that justifies your wage. But if you can show them that you can exceed beyond their expectations, that justifies a raise. How many people consciously look to exceed expectations all the time, whether it's for themselves or it's for the benefit of being promoted? A lot of people kind of tune into it half-heartedly. But I made a decision that I was going to constantly exceed expectations to prove to myself more than anybody else what I was capable of, what the kid coming from Northwest London was able to do if given the opportunity. So that's been my sort of mentality whilst I've been in the industry. And it's not been easy. I think looking after people's money is stressful. It's stressful. I mean, think how you feel when you look at your bank account, or when you run out of money, or when you spend money and you think, have I made the right choice? But
so much anxiety.
So much anxiety that's tied up with it. But also all the responsibilities that you've got. If you've got a family, whether or not that money is enough to cover everybody's needs. So there's a lot of personal issues that come with actual, how you behave with money yourself. So when you're an advisor, a lot of people project those fears and worries onto you, and that almost becomes your problem. But for anybody who ever wants to get into banking, I think one of the biggest advice I'll give you is learn how to not to make other people's problem become your problem. Right, you have to be able to draw the line. As an advisor, you have to command your respect, and that you're there to add value. If you're not there to add value, then you perhaps shouldn't be there. And so whatever worries and fears people have got, don't let that be on your mind when you go to sleep. You need to find a way to switch off. I mean, yes, you'll work all hours of the day, but that's consciously making a decision to do so. But don't let other people's failures or issues and anxiety and worries become yours, because that's how you're not an effective advisor. I think you really need to find a balance.
Okay, great context. And one of the things you mentioned was that you started during the financial crisis in 2008. In your opinion, how does the past year, 2020, with COVID compare to the financial crisis in 2008?
Good question. I think there are similar traits, but I think what's happened in the last 12 months is completely unprecedented. I think there's been previous recessions, and that's what 2008, 2009 was. That was a recession. So you can almost script it in terms of saying, okay, well, these industries are going to struggle for a bit. Then there will be this sort of recovery. There will be this type of curve, whether it's V-shape, L-shape, whatever the shape is, will bounce back. Because fundamentally, when there's a recession happening, things are still operating, right? Whereas COVID, nothing was operating. We've never seen a time like it, right? And I think that was the biggest difference, that people had to shut up shop. And that's the first time we've been told as an economy, as a country, as a nation, as a world, to literally stop what you're doing and stay in your house. It's never happened before. So I think, for a lot of people in 2008 and 9, they were finding great opportunities to pick up distressed assets here and there and turn it into something else. People jumped into the stock market in 2008 and 9 and have enjoyed, 10, 12, 13 years of growth since then, because fundamentally there were still things ticking over. COVID stopped everything. If you're in the hospitality industry in 2008, even if you got fired, you probably still went to the pub. In 2020, you cannot go to the pub, right? So if you're a pub owner or you're in a hospitality industry, you cannot operate. Nobody builds a business plan to have a period where there's no revenue, right? And that's the reality we faced in the last 12 months. So I think it's been completely different. It's been a complete game changer. But that said, people have still found opportunities with COVID. There are some industries that have done really well. But as a comparison, I think COVID was far more disruptive than the 2008-2009 financial crisis.
And from an investor's point of view, what were some of the opportunities that were found? Obviously, for context, just understanding what some people did in the past year, because I think there's been two thought processes of what we could do. Was initially it was like, okay, I've been working so hard, let me just take a bit of time off, let me relax. And then there were some people that were just really on the offense, and they were just going hard. So from your kind of experience and your clients, what were some of the things that they jumped in on that actually benefited them?
I think it's still too early to say exactly who's completely benefited from it, because we are still coming out of lockdown. But I think with any sort of disruption to the economy, there are certain industries that you think, right, that's the typical go-to. Property tends to be one of those things, because in particular this time around, though, that's backfired a little, because whereas property is typically cheap during recessions, people haven't got the money to be buying houses. Banks normally retract their appetite to lend money, and so the property market is pretty slow. Last year, a similar thing happened, in the sense that the whole market came to a standstill, which is the first time I've ever seen the property market come to a standstill. You can't go out and buy a property. However, when it reopened, stamp duty holiday was introduced. But bearing in mind that interest rates have already been very low, base rate at 0.1%, mortgage rates are low as they've ever been. So with that, plus all the pent-up demand from people who couldn't transact, when the markets reopened in last summer, property market has been booming since. So it hasn't been an equal opportunity for those who would have thought, right, this is my chance to go grab some deals, because actually it's done the opposite. It's actually inflated prices. But I think what people have been looking at, I was speaking to someone recently who's acquired a whole bunch of hotels. And it's a brave move, because you think, okay, what's the world going to look like once we're all out of lockdown? Are people going to flood straight back to their normal outgoings, hotels, etc., or are people going to be a bit more reserved? But they've taken a long-term view. So I think what this pandemic has done versus any normal recession is people are now having to really think carefully and considered and long-term about where they're putting their money into, because it may not turn around in a year or two. It may take a lot longer than that. So it's like even investing, for example, airplanes have been grounded for a year pretty much, right? But there's a part of me that says, well, people are going to be taking holidays again soon. So yes, whilst a lot of shares in airplanes came down, well, aren't they going to go back up once people start booking holidays and flights again? So you really had to think forward in terms of, right, where is the smart money going to be in 2 years' time? And you have to take that view. And I think that's the thing around investments. If you treat investments as a short-term play, then you're probably going to miss out on the long-term growth. You have to think far ahead and think, right, am I comfortable to sit tight and wait for this thing to really perform? A lot of people don't give investments the time it needs. Mm-hmm. And so they jump in, doesn't do as well as they thought it would in a few weeks or a few months, and they jump out. And then they probably sit on the sidelines whilst they watch it climb back up. And they'll probably buy in, but at much higher prices they would have got while they're already in. So, I think, look, the opportunities have been not as obvious as, let's say, in 2008 and 2009, but people were buying hand sanitizers at the start of lockdown. That's something that you couldn't have foreseen or thought about before the pandemic, and people made quick change of that. Now hand sanitizers aren't in demand. Toilet roll, the local corner shops were adding premiums to toilet roll. So it was very quick thinking you have to think on your feet as in, right, what's the next thing? And, demand is usually what drives, profitability. So what have we got a shortage of? I mean, at one point you couldn't get pasta in the shops, so people have to think really quickly on their feet in terms of what's the next thing I could do. But those things aren't sustainable, because once we come out of lockdown, all those things are going to be back on full flow. And therefore, if you had invested heavily in those, you might have made a bit of gain, but what's that going to look like for the long term?
Would you say it was your most challenging time in 13, 14 years? Because even I think economists were split whether, it's going to be a thing of, okay, the demand is going to bounce back because of people being cooped up and not being able to access those services, versus even if they do want to do these things, perhaps they won't have the disposable income to do that. So from a financial point of view, where you're managing other people's money, would you think it was your most challenging time?
I would say it was the most challenging in the sense that clients literally did not know if they would have a business by the end of the year. And like I said, even with a recession, you used to have options of how you can navigate the situation and find a way out. But when everything comes to a standstill,
there's no forward planning.
It's difficult to forward plan. Will my industry exist when we come out of this pandemic? So I think, yes, it was perhaps the most challenging time because of the lack of foresight and being able to see, hey, how long were we going to be locked up for? That wasn't in our control. Was this virus going to be curved? What if the vaccination didn't work? Does that mean the lockdown will be extended? And if that happens, will the government therefore need to give out more support, in furlough, in bounce back loans, in CBILS? And then the long-term implications of that, what does that do for companies and industry? So yes, in answer to your question, I think nobody saw this coming, right? I think with recessions, we thought it was 3 weeks, right? With a recession, there are commentators who say, I foresee a recession on the horizon if GDP is starting to contract and we're not, doing as much, productivity is low and, stock markets are tumbling. And there are certain signs that you can say, okay, yeah, this looks like a recession. But we literally thought COVID was going to be a 3-week stay at home and then back to normal. And here we are over a year later. So I think that's what made it very difficult.
Obviously, all the things that came with the pandemic aside, do you think that a recession was almost needed because it was overdue?
I don't think a recession is ever needed.
Because where I'm going with this is because I think, we went through the era of Silicon Valley and, companies raising capital and, not profitable at all and just keep going. Same with stocks, crypto, all of these things, they had really been, hyped up in terms of supply versus demand. So do you think that the crash, obviously we still don't know how it's going to play out, but do you think the crash was almost needed for the market in terms of the health of the market?
I think every stage where you find an inflated price, it needs a bit of correction. That's normal. Whether or not we needed a complete crash is another story, because I think, a lot of these inflated values would have naturally been corrected anyway. But COVID hit us just as when the economy was about to have some great momentum. Because if you remember, 2019, at the end of 2019 was the elections. Yes. And we had this whole Brexit thing hanging over us, and we had just finished the elections, and confidence was just starting to return, and then bang, COVID hit. So, I think what you talk about with Silicon Valley and all these companies who are non-profitable, raising money, etc., that's a whole nother conversation, because COVID hasn't stopped that. In fact, what you've seen is Deliveroo, IPO. You've seen so many different IPOs which haven't really lived up to expectation. Yeah. And that talks fundamentally to the substance of what these companies are. So no matter how much you dress a frog is still a frog. And I think that's what people have to understand. Before you put your money into anything, understand the fundamentals of what you're putting your money into. Because I think the age of Silicon Valley and how businesses achieve valuations will continue. The reason being is private equity firms are greedy to a degree, but there's a reason why they're greedy. They pump a lot of money into something with the expectation that they're going to quadruple their money in X amount of years. So they drive those values, right? They're incentivized to make sure that the thing they've put their money into gets the biggest valuation it can possibly achieve. But that's not always great news for the investor. What happens is when these companies IPO, all those initial investors take their money off the table. So they de-risk, and now they pass on all that risk to the public. That will continue as long as these companies are happy to give valuations that, these companies aren't making a profit and they're worth billions. There's nothing tangible, right? There's nothing tangible that you can hang your hat on. It's all about, expectations and, what they expect to achieve in X amount of years and the market that they're kind of operating and controlling in. But for the founders of these companies, it's super stressful because, you create this business, right? Somebody comes along, gives you a very big check and says, right, now you are a minority shareholder. We're now going to pull the strings in terms of what happens with your business. You're still touted as the owner of this company, but you really don't have any buying power anymore. And they really run with your business. So you're just sort of sat by on a nice salary with a bit of money in the bank, watching these investors, these PE firms, really take your business to the next level without much say. And it's a really stressful position to be in. I know a lot of people who've been in that situation, and it's a lot of stress.
Definitely.
So I think that in itself is an industry. That's an industry problem. That's not a recession thing. And I don't think recession will fix it, because there's nothing stopping another company coming up tomorrow with all the incentives, with all the kind of, ambition that, a PE firm won't come along and give it all the money it wants in order to try and inflate the value. So that's an industry issue that needs to be addressed.
Interesting. So at the start of the show, I kind of talked about this being almost a class where we're going to talk about things that, we don't necessarily learn in education. There was a lot that I didn't learn in education. I studied economics and didn't learn any of the things that were, beneficial to business or my personal life. And, I'm still well informed because I go out and search for information, but there's a lot of people that they only follow what the books tell them or what the school system tells them. So I'm going to throw it over to you in terms of some of the, the most common questions that you get from young people or of any age that from your perspective is just a complete misconception, or, it's something that people really need to learn.
I think for me, the biggest misconception is the idea of what you need to be wealthy, what it means to be rich, what it means to have all the money in the bank, what it means when your name appears in the Forbes list, for example. There are a lot of people who are on the Forbes list who shouldn't be on the Forbes list. And there are more people who could be on there but are not. Because at the end of the day, it's all about who you give access to, right? And it's a journalist who will gather the information and publish it. So I think it's about society and how society, makes us worship various things. The challenge for me, how I see it, is that a lot of people are shown how the end result could look, but they're not taught how to actually get there. And so people never get there. I could come in here and dangle some Ferrari keys and say, hey, look, you could drive this one day and walk out. What has that done to you? It's giving you an idea, but it's not giving you any tangibles in terms of how to achieve that idea. So I think that's the problem that we have in society. But the misconceptions is all about being wealthy, what it means to be wealthy. Can we agree on something that if somebody lives in £1 million house but has a £500,000 mortgage, they're not a millionaire?
Yeah.
Right? So I think a lot of people, again, I live in £1 million house, you must be a millionaire. Is that sort of association with numbers and what they mean? And, like I said about the Forbes list, there's a lot of people who are on there because of their company's revenue. Well, your company revenue is not your revenue. And what is the bottom line? What is the net profit?
Sometimes even valuation.
Or even valuation. And again, for the average person, that doesn't really translate. There's nothing tangible there. As far as they're concerned, wow, you're in the Forbes list. You must be rich. You must have a lot of money. But I think, look, it's about learning the rules of the game. And the rules of the game is simple, right? So everybody wants to grow their money, or you would like to think so anyway, right? Because if you don't grow your money, over the years, inflation will reduce the buying power of your money. That's rule 101, right? Basic as it gets. So people talk about investing. I have a problem with the word investing now. I think in the digital age that we're in, the term investing, I think, has been overemphasized to the point where when you hear it, it sends people's minds running and thinking, oh my God, I need to be, clever. I need to know this. I need to know that. I need to do this. I need to do that. And so the word investing now brings more anxiety to people than hope, right? So let's talk about investing without using the word investing. Okay. So if you've got money, you want to grow your money. It's very rare that you can grow your money reasonably and responsibly whilst it's sitting in cash. Okay. Because the rate of return you get on deposits are very low. When base rate is at 0.1%, you're not going to get anything reasonable for cash. So you turn that cash into an asset and you hold that asset for a long enough period for it to gain some value until such point that you're ready to turn that asset back into cash. That's investing, right? Now, let's overlay that with what assets you choose. So is it property? Is it stocks and shares? Is it commodities? Is it other, desirable assets, etc.? That then effectively leads into, what you put your money into to meet your objective. So that's effectively how you take cash to buy an asset. You grow that asset until you're ready to turn that asset back into cash. That is simply what investing is. But when people start out, I think the problem is people are applying short-term thinking to long-term goals. And if that's your mindset, then you're setting yourself up to fail. If you want to put money into the stock market, you can't treat it like it's day trading. There's a place for that, right? Forex or whatever else, there's a place for that. But if you're buying into companies, you're buying into companies with the ambition that you're going to sit still for a while, ride the wave, right? Until such a time that you've gained enough that you take your money back out. Bearing in mind that there is never a guarantee, right? I think also people think investing means that you're guaranteed to get a return. You are not guaranteed to get a return. So you have to be comfortable with whatever you're going to put your money into. So again, turning your money or cash into asset, you have to be comfortable with whatever that asset is going to be. Is it liquid or is it illiquid? How quickly can you turn it back into cash? Does it need a big market or is it a niche market, right? These are the sort of questions you ask yourself before you put your money into anything. And also, how much risk can you afford to take with that particular asset? Is it volatile? When you're measuring volatility, it's not just about how quickly your investment rises, but also how much do you lose when times are bad? So if you've got an asset that can shoot up by £10,000 in a week, but then it comes back down by £10,000, then what's the point of that fluctuation? You gain nothing from that. So how volatile is the asset you're putting your money into? These are the sort of questions people need to be asking themselves when they think about growing their money. So I think that's very pertinent because at the moment, everywhere you look, everyone's talking about investing, whether it's crypto assets or whether it's stocks and shares. And look, it's a good thing that people are becoming more knowledgeable about it. But equally, I think people can be burnt if they're not doing the right due diligence before they actually put their money into anything.
Okay. And from a realistic point of view, because I think there's a lot of people, like you said, that invest blindly because of social pressure or FOMO, just kind of wanting to get in. But what is the importance of measuring being illiquid versus liquid?
Yeah.
Because we were talking off camera about, how entrepreneurs live day to day and that, you have to learn things the hard way, that you may not be able to make money every single month. And some entrepreneurs, they're very heavily invested and so they don't even have day-to-day income, whilst the perception is that they're multi-millionaires. And then we've also seen the other extreme where, cash, Pablo Escobar, for example, cash, just rotted. So I think growing up in, ethnic minority areas and, not as privileged areas, I think there's a big misconception of what the value of cash is. And, the other extreme is, I'm going to be fully invested. So what's your thoughts on that?
Again, it's about understanding what your personal liquidity requirements are. So, as we were speaking before, there are a lot of people who have all their wealth, income, cash tied up into assets. And the problem you've got with that is if you end up needing liquidity, i.e. cash to cover any bills or any unexpected items, you then have to go and sell one of those assets. Now, if you're selling something during a downturn, then you're crystallizing a loss. So that is the consideration you need to give to how you effectively arrange your investment portfolio. Diversification is super important when it comes to that. So what do I mean by that? When we talk about turning your cash into assets, think about the different buckets you can put your money into. It spreads the risk, because if you've got it all in one asset class and that asset class goes through a traumatic time in the economy, you might lose all your money. But if you've got it spread across, then at least if one doesn't do so well, another might. The problem with not having enough cash flow is, like I said, you're then forced to sell assets at a time where it might not be ideal to sell those assets. So what tends to happen is when people have all their cash tied up, they end up relying on credit. And this is why it's important to have good credit, because if you don't have good credit, and this is your credit score, you're normally left to second tier lenders, people who are going to charge you astronomically to lend to you because you've got bad credit.
Payday loans.
And it's not even payday loans sometimes. It's just sub prime lenders, let's say. People who aren't normally the first you think of when you want to borrow any money. But when you leave yourself short of cash flow, you're scrambling around to try and make ends meet. And sometimes that can derail everything else you've got going on. You know, if you default on your mortgage, for example, because you've got all these clever investments and you've got no cash, well, your house could end up being repossessed. And if that house gets repossessed, you're now having to sell probably one of your biggest assets just because you've tied up all your money in different places. So I think it's about having a balance that if you've got money invested, always leave yourself with some liquidity. You know, any investment manager will always tell you that firstly, before you invest any money, are there any expensive debts you should be paying off? Because what is the trade-off? You know, if you're trying to invest your money, but you can't guarantee the return, bear that in mind. But the debt you're paying is guaranteed. And so you know how much interest you're being charged. Does the investment outweigh the cost of that debt you've got? If it doesn't, then are you just better off paying that off? Even if you have to start from scratch again, at least you don't owe anybody money or you're not paying any expensive debt. So again, it's having that trade-off to say, right, I've got money invested, but I've got some liquidity as well. Or at least I've got some very easy assets that I can liquidate. Nothing that's too specialized, you know, that I can't turn into cash very quickly. So I think it's having a balance that's super important.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the importance of credit, and that's something that I think is not spoken about at all.
Yeah.
Because when you're going through the education system, you turn 18 and you have access to credit, and you can get credit cards, you can get finance, you can get all these things. Yet no one has given you a lesson on it. And a lot of the time in your households, money is not really spoken about.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a lot of misconceptions that I've experienced. What are some of the most common things that people kind of completely get wrong in terms of credit?
I think it's just a lack of respect for credit. People just don't assume it's important. I mean, look, when you're at school, trigonometry is cool. But knowing how to handle your money when you leave school is even more important, right, than trigonometry. Let's be honest.
Definitely.
And I think people just go into it blindly, not understanding the impact that not paying a phone bill or not paying a parking ticket could ultimately have on your credit, you know, when you are ready to take on some real financial commitments. That is the first misconception, the fact that people don't take it seriously enough. Not having access to credit can really limit your financial firepower to the point where you can't leverage. You know, the way that a lot of wealthy individuals build their wealth is through leverage, right? It's using your own money to buy an asset, leveraging that asset to buy another asset, perhaps leveraging that asset to buy another asset.
Let's really break that down because I think a lot of us saw the ASDA deal that happened, and it came out after that. A lot of that money was debt. Good debt, obviously. I think a lot of people, practicality-wise, they don't understand what that means. So could you just break that down a little bit?
Yeah, so what leverage is effectively when you use borrowed money to advance your objectives. So, you know, when you're buying a house, for example, you could have the cash to buy outright, but then that's all your money tied up in an illiquid asset. Or you could leverage and you could actually borrow half of the value and you still got half of the money in your bank account. So you still get the asset, but you've still got half of your money, which you can then go and use to do something else. So leverage is really, it's an add-on, it's an addition that helps you to really fulfill your objectives without you being fully committed. It also spreads the risk. If something happens, you're not 100% in it. You've got the risk shared with somebody else, normally an institution or a bank or lender, an investor, etc. But that's the power of leverage. And for those people who haven't got good credit, you're missing out on the ability to really use leverage. But not just any leverage, using the right kind of money, the right type of debt, as you say. I mean, yes, when you're growing business, I think leverage is more important in business than anywhere else. It's being able to get funding, get investments to really grow your business. How do you enter a new market or a new customer base unless you've got that capital expenditure to actually take you there? And sometimes you can't just use your revenue or, you know, the income you make from the business to do that. You do need some fresh injection of capital. And if your business has a bad credit score or your business is, you know, the books are in a terrible state, nobody's going to want to put money into your business. So I think credit for an individual is important. Credit as a business in terms of how you operate is important too. I think a lot of people, when they start out in business, because of all the things they hear about, if you're an entrepreneur, you can make a lot of money, not pay any tax. You know, you can put all your expenses through your business. You can really minimize the corporation tax you pay. A lot of people get sidetracked by that. And so they basically run their business barely making a profit. And they think that's great. It might work for you, fine. But when you come to grow that business, or you go to seek a bank loan, or you go to get an investment, and someone looks at your books and says, well, this business is not profitable, why would I put money into this? Then they shoot themselves in the foot.
Even during COVID, for example, like people that perhaps weren't showing the accurate figures, let's say, and they were tax avoiding, and they weren't able to get access to furlough or some of the bounce back loans, grants, all of that stuff. So that's also impacted people.
Yeah. Look, I mean, how you arrange your books is normally a conversation between you and your accountant. And means accountants can be wizards. I mean, they can be really useful, or they can make your life a living hell. There are definitely ways in which you can manage your affairs tax efficiently. But like I said, I think some people get sidetracked by the idea that I'm going to put all my personal expenses through this. I'm going to minimize all the profits so that I don't pay any corporation tax. That might work once you're a small company. But when you're trying to grow and you're trying to get leverage, and someone's going to look at your books and says, I'm not going to put money into this. So you have to be careful of how you set out, that you don't, shoot yourself in the foot for when you really want to grow your business.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the other side of credit, where maybe it's not an entrepreneur, maybe it's just the average 9-to-5 person. There's also extremes where you have the Dave Ramseys of the world that say debt is completely something you don't want to get involved in. What's your thoughts on that?
Put it this way, there are more individuals I work with debt than those who don't have debt. And I think it can be a very narrow-minded view that debt is bad and don't touch debt, because you're missing out on the opportunity of leverage, right? Why do you want to be fully exposed with all your assets into one thing when you could leverage it and use part of your own money to do something else with it? I think, look, there are these people who say things to grab headlines, I think, sometimes. And you really have to ask yourself, has he never taken debt in his life? Or has he just now built himself to a place whereby he's been able to repay all his debt, so he's debt-free? But how can you give that advice to somebody who's just starting out? If I tell you here that you're trying to buy a house or you're trying to do this, and I say, don't buy it, don't take any debt. So you have to wait until you can save up, £250,000 to afford the average house in the UK.
Minimum.
Well, how long is that going to take you? Right? So you've got to be sensible about some of this advice you hear on, YouTube or these, famous entrepreneurs, because they've gone through a process to get to where they are. So they can sell you whatever they want to sell you. But that doesn't always apply in your situation, right? You can take on debt. Nothing is wrong with debt, as long as it's manageable, right? The problem arises when you start missing payments, you start defaulting, and you've taken on more debt than you can afford. That's when you're in trouble. But there's nothing wrong with the concept of debt at all. Whether it's a loan, whether it's a credit card, whether it's car finance, there's nothing wrong with it. At the end of the day, if you can draw a line in the middle of a paper, put your assets and liabilities on either side, as long as you've got some assets and they outweigh your liabilities, then great. People talk about, invest your money, use the income to pay for your liabilities. How long is that going to take? Let's be realistic here. If somebody's in their 20s now and wants to buy a car, you either don't buy the car, or you effectively find a way that you can finance it to get the car. Because if I'm saying to a 20-year-old, invest your money and use the residual income to service it, well, A, how much money have you got to invest? How long is it going to take for you to generate that level of residual income to afford your car payments? All right, let's be realistic here. And I think that's the problem I have with a lot of these headlines, that it's not realistic. Like I said, people will preach about the end result, but not tell you how to actually get there. Right? And that's the challenge we've got in society, I think.
And that's why when we look at the actual statistics, whether that's HMRC statistics or government statistics, that's the real wake-up call. When we kind of see, how much people are earning compared to what they say, how much people have in their savings account, all of this kind of stuff. And that's why I think this advice is so important just for everyone, because there's always things that you can learn. And one of the biggest things I think that will impact people and benefit people is cars. You mentioned it. Now you have PCP, you have lease, you have buying it outright. You have so many options. We're also in the era where people want to impress others slightly more because of social media and access. And so these things have become a little bit more enticing. So of course it's subjective based on the individual's goals, situation, but generally, what is the benefit of getting a finance or lease versus buying outright? So
if you buy a car outright, you're going to need to put down the capital from day one. So if you're buying a £20,000 car, you need to have £20,000 in the bank. And not just that, then you need the money for the ongoing maintenance. So if all you've got to your name is £20,000 and you want to buy a £20,000 car, once you've bought it, that money's gone. Bearing in mind that most cars will depreciate. So it's not going to be worth £20,000 in a month, let alone, 5 years. It really comes down to a question of how long you intend on keeping the car for. Some people are happy to buy a used car. As you say, because of society these days, nobody wants a used car. Everybody wants a brand new car straight from the showroom. But it depends on how long you intend to keep the car. So if you're somebody who, you want to buy a car, 10 years, you're going to keep it, then there's no harm in you actually going out and spending the money and just buying a car outright, because you don't have any monthly payments. All you have to focus on then is just your insurance, any maintenance, etc., and that's it. Whereas if you don't have all the money up front, but you need a car, then your only option is to use the finance route. Now, when you use finance, it gives you the ability to maybe buy a more expensive car than you might have otherwise been able to afford. That's a good and bad thing. It's good because, yes, it gets you a car. Bad because sometimes it means people spend above their means because they've got a vehicle, they've got something that enables them to buy something more expensive than they otherwise would have bought. But when you have a car in finance, just remember that your finance payments is one thing, then your insurance, then your maintenance, then everything else that comes with it. So it's not always just about the purchase, it's about the ongoing commitments. And a lot of people forget that. However, when you have finance, at least there's usually a limited time frame. If you've got a PCP, for example, it's 4 years. You're only committed to that car for 4 years. At the end of it, you hand the car back, off you go. It's a bit like renting versus buying a house. When you're renting, you're never going to see that money ever again. When you're leasing a car, you're never going to see that money again. Whereas if you buy it outright, at least there's an intrinsic value that when you do come to sell it one day, even if there's £1,000 of value left in it, you'll sell it and get your £1,000 back. But it's about the convenience. If you don't want that long-term approach and you actually just want to drive a new car every 4 years and you're happy to put down the deposit, pay your monthly outgoings, then the leasing is an efficient option. Again, I think sometimes people can demonize these things and say, oh my God, don't buy a car in finance. But funny enough, when I do my polls on Instagram, a lot of people seem to have issues with car finance, which again makes me think one of two things: that they're overcommitting themselves from the start, or they're not really doing the numbers to see that actually, does this add up? Because yes, I've got my monthly payments for the car, but once I add petrol, insurance, maintenance, how much does that actually come up to? And I think people need to do that work before they actually commit to buying it, because that shows you the real affordability picture, rather than just, oh yeah, it's £500 a month. Once you add insurance and everything else, it might be more like £800 a month, and can you afford that? Whereas if you just buy it outright, then you don't need to worry about those additions. So I think that's just really the differences.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned renting and versus buying in terms of the property world, and we'll get to that. But before we do, in terms of the practical tips, like you mentioned with car finances and general credit that you take, you do have to do the work to understand whether you can actually afford it, because the person who's selling you the car, they just want the deal, right? Yeah. And they're not going to factor that in. So what are some things that people practically can do? I know when I first started, when I made some mistakes along the way with credit, I benefit from an Excel sheet, for example. So people that don't have access to, wonderful people like yourself, maybe they're not on that level yet, what can they do just in their day-to-day to better their finances or get a clearer picture?
I think have some discipline. You talked about Excel, so I assume you mean something like a budget spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Very important. Being able to see where your money's going, I think for me is the first step into improving your finances. For a lot of people, when they walk up to the till and they tap their card, they're not even sure if it's going to go through or not.
I find that bizarre. Honestly, I find that bizarre. How can you go to the shop and hope that it's going to go through?
It's the anxiety. People don't want to check. People have a sort of a arm's length approach when it comes to their bank balance and their account. And that's just the complete wrong mentality to have. You need to have clear sight of all your money, where it's at all the time, right? And having a spreadsheet can help you do that. Introduce that discipline, that every month you know what income you have, you know what your expenditure is, you know what you're left with, what your net disposable income is. What do you then do with that net disposable income? Do you put some to an ISA? Do you invest some? Do you put some in savings? Do you, whatever you do with it, right? Have that breakdown. It doesn't take a genius to put that together. I promise you, go onto Excel, put on a new spreadsheet and just put one line at the top, all the months in the year, and on the left-hand side, put down all your bills, right? So every month, you know, right, how much you can, it helps you also to track just to see, once you can see it visually, am I spending too much money here in this section, right? Can I cut down my bills in this section, right? And you have that dialogue with yourself all the time. I have that dialogue with myself all the time. Where can I save some money here? Because, you know, it's all about growing your money, right? And I think for a lot of people, before you even start thinking about wealth, think about income. focus on your income. Because if you're not focused on your income, how do you generate that cash to turn into an asset? Right? Again, we're not going to use the word investment. Let's just talk about turning cash into assets, growing that asset and then turning it back into cash. If you're not creating enough of that cash, forget about the rest, right? So if you've got a 9 to 5 and you're not an entrepreneur and you don't have a side hustle, just focus on the money that you're making, right? And the more of it that you can keep for yourself, then the more opportunities you've got to turn that cash into an asset. Automate everything. And when I say that, I mean, don't trust yourself that on payday or a few days after payday that you're going to manually move your money into your savings or your ISA. Don't do it. Set up a standing order for all your savings. Set up direct debits for all your debts. Don't trust yourself to do anything manually, because there might be a day where you forget, or when that money's gone, psychologically, it lets you know that, right, I can't kind of just play around with that now because it's gone. Whereas when it's there, man, I really want those new trainers this month, and before I move it, let me just buy it quickly. And once I bought it, it's gone. And okay, now I'm going to put the rest in savings, right? I've automated my savings and, had direct debits for all my expenditure for years and years and years. That way, when the money hits your account, when you check your account, it's not even there because it's already tucked away in those different pockets. And that's what the spreadsheet helps you to do. So you know that every month you're sending £200 here, £300 here, £400 here, £500 here. It's in all those buckets. And then you just review how those buckets are doing. Again, turning that cash into assets once it gets to a level that's significant enough. Because, again, a lot of people are trying to move mountains with numbers that you can't move a cup with, right? Oh, I've got £5,000. What can I buy? It's just like, perhaps maybe if you haven't got a long-term approach, then you shouldn't be thinking of doing anything with it, right? So it's about growing that cash to a significant enough position that you can then turn it into an asset. Mm-hmm. But discipline,
definitely. And one thing that I also learned along the way, which you might agree with, is I've seen a lot of people do those spreadsheets and they've only included their direct debits. They're not including the day-to-day spending, going out money, all of that stuff. And then they look at the end of the month and they're like, whoa, like I did this wrong, or they overspend and maybe they've eaten into their direct debit money. So that's also another thing that I would recommend.
100%. Like I said, income, committed expenditure, so all your loans, car finance, mortgage, rent, whatever, and then credit card bills as well. People forget things like that. So when you've spent money on your credit card, you have to make minimum payments every month. You have to factor that into your spreadsheet, because you can't spend all the money and then think, I've got nothing left to put into this credit card, right? So you've got to have a foresight of, right, where is all this money going to go before it even lands? So when it lands, it's committed. That way there's no temptation for you to go and spend money that you don't have. So that discipline is very important. But yes, you need to put food, travel, discretionary spend, and then give yourself some discretionary money as well, because in that way, when that's done, you know that, right, I've used up my allocation for this month. And therefore, if you do have to go take money from somewhere else, you feel the guilt because you think, oh man, and you might second guess some of these motives you get invited to.
Yeah, definitely. And let's go into the property discussion now. Renting versus buying. There's a lot of opinions online. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. I'm gonna point out one extreme that I've heard recently, and also the other perspectives, which is Grant Cardone. His perspective is don't buy a house unless you're buying it to let, to obviously to make money from it. If you're living there, you should rent. That's his perspective, if you didn't already. And then you have the other perspectives, which is, no matter what, I'm not renting. I'm going to buy a house. I'm going to live in that house, and that's it. And then after that, potentially thinking about, investing in property. What's your perspective? I know it's subjective, but generally.
It is. But again, that's why I always say to people, take some of these things that you hear online with a pinch of salt. Because I'm sure for him, he's got to a position in his life whereby he's been able to generate enough cash to turn it into assets, to be in the position whereby he would only finance if it's being rented out or whatever else. But if he lives in it, he's never going to take any debt against it. For most people, that is not their reality. So when you come out with those statements, like I said, it's a great vision, but it's just not tangible, right? It's not tangible. Think about how many people who can be in a position where they own multiple properties in this country. Not a lot of people, right? So if you're saying to me that you're going to just rent and all the additional money you have, you're going to try and do something else with it, you have to really look at the trade-off, right? Like I said, anything you rent, you're never going to see that money back again. So whatever money you have left, is that enough for you to actually achieve anything significant with? Probably not. If you're on average salary in the UK and your rent consumes more than 50% of your income, you're telling me that's a smarter route to take than to actually save the money to buy the house, get some capital appreciation over the years, be able to pay off the mortgage at some point, be able to take equity back out of that asset to help your children to get onto the ladder. If you don't own the house, where do you get the money to do any of that from? Again, it's the leverage, right? Having a property as an asset gives you leverage. It gives you something that you can always go back to. We were speaking earlier on that there are a lot of people in the country now who live in very expensive houses and very expensive postcodes who don't earn enough to maintain those properties because they've inherited it down the line. Fine, they might not be able to maintain it, but if they sell those assets, that gives them a lot of cash that they can then go and turn into many other assets, right? But again, there's always that starting point. So I think for me, have a starting point before you go and decide that, right, okay, any other property that I have now is going to be financed in this way or not financed in that way. Have a starting point, because for a lot of people, the reality is you're not going to be in his situation right now where you can afford to make that call, right? But you need a starting point.
And another thing that people maybe don't factor in when they're buying a house, let's say they completely ignore the Grant Cardone example, and they're just following what they've been taught, which is buy a house, get on the property ladder for personal living arrangement. They also don't factor in the maintenance, and you might be paying a mortgage payment if the property is still in debt, but then there's so many other things to factor in as well. So is that also something that you would advise?
Yeah, but I think, look, part of the house buying process is also the responsibility of whoever gives you the mortgage, if you are taking a mortgage, to make sure that you can afford it. And the affordability check isn't just your mortgage payments, but it's everything else that goes around with it. If you're buying a flat, you're paying your mortgage, you're paying service charge, you might pay ground rent, and then you've also got council tax, and that's before your bills. Right, so where's the money for anything else? And so yes, part of the whole affordability assessment takes all those things into account. So I would like to think that when the banks are lending you the money, they're doing the right affordability checks, because that's all part of making sure that they're not going to put you in a position whereby you can't afford to upkeep that property and they have to then repossess it. But again, I think sometimes people overcommit again, where they assume that, oh yeah, sure, this will be fine, and they haven't really done those numbers. The same thing with the car finance. The car payments is one thing, but insurance and maintenance and road tax and everything else and petrol is another thing. So I think, yes, you do have to consider, but that doesn't change if you're renting. If you're renting, you've still got to pay all those bills anyway, right? So at the end of the day, like I said, you need a starting point. And owning property is not for everybody. I mean, like you said, it is subjective. Some people can decide, actually, I don't want to take on a mortgage. I don't want to own an asset. Fine. But I just hope then that you're using that money to do something else, which is going to bring just as much benefit. It's something that owning an asset, which over the years will appreciate in value, which you can then revisit to take equity off, leverage to then do other things with it. Give me something else that is going to be the equivalent then if you're not going to do that. That's what I would say to somebody who says that.
Mm-hmm. Let's move the topic on a little bit, because I'm conscious of time. I want to make sure that we're going through it as much as possible. Yeah. We try not to use the word investing, but we're probably going to have to in this context, and that's stocks, but more importantly crypto. We mentioned stocks a little bit about it's a long-term play and don't treat it as day trading, but crypto is something that obviously has taken over our social media. That's all we're seeing, right? Yeah. And you obviously have different perspectives. Some that are they're invested themselves, so naturally their opinion is going to be towards crypto. But then you also have people that are realistic and say, I don't know anything about crypto, so I'm not going to advise on it. I'm sure you have clients that have probably inquired about crypto, and obviously you have a lot of experience in general. So what's your thoughts on crypto, and where do you see it going as well?
I think crypto is exciting, right? And, if you speak badly against crypto, the crypto warriors come for you, because there are so many people who live and die by crypto. So we can't speak bad about crypto because it's exciting, if nothing else. During lockdown, it gave everybody something to think about, something to talk about. It was a new sensation, and so I think it's something that's definitely, we can't ignore anymore, right? Let's be honest. I think there's enough transactions happening with crypto that we can't ignore it anymore. But what my personal views on that, I have exposure to crypto, by the way, just in case people tend to assume I'm anti-crypto. I'm not anti-crypto. I'm just anti people not taking calculated risks. I've got exposure to it. So when it's going up and down and bouncing around all the place, okay, I feel it too. But I haven't got that much exposure in it where it keeps me up at night, right? Because fundamentally, you have to think about what is the risk to anything that you're going to put your money into. If I invest in a company on the FTSE 100 or FTSE 250 or whatever, I know that the risks are several. You know, I could invest in a hotel company, and you know, there could be an attack on the restaurant or the hotel. There could be, you know, COVID. It could shut down. It might not operate, etc. There are lots of risks that could affect my investment, and those risks are, I would say, rare to none. Because how often do we have COVID, or how often does, you know, a hotel chain get shut down or whatever else, right? But with something like crypto, the biggest risk is rules and regulation, right? So it doesn't take much to destabilize it. The biggest risk to crypto is rules and regulation and
like
law
recently
and
we
laws.
saw America impose
Turkey.
a tax. Turkey, yeah.
Turkey banning people from transacting in crypto. So for me, that has to tell you something, that, okay, if the biggest risk to this thing is just simple laws and regulation, then the ability for it to fluctuate is insane, right? I think what we have to be careful of here is that crypto was designed to counteract normal currency, to counteract the mainstream, right? If the mainstream wants to really make crypto's life difficult, it can do that. It can introduce rules. And as soon as it does that, all the people who are trying to bypass the mainstream now lose interest in it. And what happens when people lose interest in it? They sell out. And what happens when people start selling out? It drops in value. So I think for me, look, Bitcoin is obviously the leader at the moment. But the way that thing fluctuates sometimes, it tells you that as soon as a headline comes out against it, I find it almost like someone's child. And if you say something bad about it, they go nuts, they go crazy. And that's how Bitcoin kind of behaves sometimes. One headline can send it tumbling, right? But then there are loads of other options. You know, Ethereum has sort of captured headlines in recent weeks because that seems to have more of a substance behind it. And lots of the other cryptos actually use the basis of Ethereum. But Dogecoin, you know, you probably saw that. You know, that just shows you the era we've entered, how you can create value from anything, but you can't create the substance, right? So look, I think for me with Bitcoin and crypto, like I said, we can't ignore it. It remains to be seen in the future that it will play, depending on how the rule makers decide to treat it. You know, recently HMRC are now, you know, asking people to disclose if they've got any digital wallets or crypto assets if you're filling in an asset form. And so I think it's becoming more mainstream, and the more mainstream it becomes, the more mainstream rules it attracts. And the more mainstream rules it attracts, the less desirable it becomes for those people trying to avoid the mainstream. So I think approach it with caution. A lot of people have made money from it, but will it continue at the pace that it's gone at? Nobody knows. That's the truth. You know, nobody who swears by it can tell me that crypto is definitely going to hit $100,000 by the end of the year. At the start of the year, everyone thought it would, but what's happened recently is tanked, and it's kind of maintained a little bit around that sort of mark where it's at now. But is it still carrying on at that pace where it was at the start of the year? Probably not. So I just think you have to be cautious with it.
Mm-hmm. And finally, another thing that's, you know, gained a lot of headlines is NFTs. Yep. Could we just break that down a little bit for people that don't know anything about it, and, you know, also where the market's going in terms of that direction? Because I think we're bombarded with things nowadays, and it's easy to not be able to keep up.
Yeah. So I think NFTs is similar to this whole digital currency, trying to create value that's away from the mainstream, right? And so now, you know, you're looking at how you monetize digital assets, which you can't grab or hold, right? It's kind of, you know, monetizing things that people have created in a digital capacity. So again, it's creating value away from the norm. And typically, if you take this back into the old days, whenever people were trying to hedge against normal currencies, i.e. cash, they went for commodities, gold, silver, etc. Because we're in the digital age, people are trying to find the digital equivalent, except the fundamentals are very different. That these markets they're creating is only relevant for the people who are interested in these markets. Whereas gold, for example, if you've got gold bars, whenever the stock markets have underperformed, people have gone to gold and silver and, you know, those commodities, because they've been around forever, they will be around forever, and those are things that people can kind of count on. you have to be careful with these new digital forms because it seems to be following a cycle of the hype. But if nobody has an interest in it, then there is no market for it. Yes, there are some crazy amounts of people who've traded things on, NFTs recently. A tweet that was sold for, I think, £2 million or something, or $2 million or whatever it was. But how many more tweets are you going to sell for that sort of value? So again, don't buy the headline. I think these days, people round up their success to the nearest headline. And that's just to grab your attention for you to freak out and think, what am I missing out on? Again, it always comes back down to the fundamental. You want to turn your cash into an asset that will grow over the years until you're ready to turn the asset back into cash. But you need to really think about what that asset is before you put your money into it.
Amazing. I could sit here all day. I think I'm going to watch this back and get my notepad out as well. But honestly, really, really appreciate it. Before we wrap up though, even though we're in suits, we're going to have a bit of fun.
Of course.
So I think people maybe want to know a little bit more about Urban Financier.
Yep.
On a personal level, just a bit of banter. So I'm going to do rapid fire. Okay. So just answer the question as quickly as you can. Try not to think too much. And that's it. Let's go. Night in or night out?
Night in.
Pepsi or Coke?
Coke.
Money or love?
Love.
Laundry or dishes?
Laundry.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Your favorite city in the world?
Oh, that's a tough one. Favorite city in the world? London.
Really? Okay. Interesting. Nice car or nice home?
Nice home.
Netflix or YouTube?
YouTube.
AJ or Fury?
AJ.
Let's hope so. Ronaldo or Messi?
Messi.
Damn. What's your favorite supercar?
Favorite supercar? Pagani.
Ooh, that's a unique one. Horror or comedy movie?
Comedy.
When you're not working, how do you like to spend your time?
Reading up on the economy. Or cars. I like cars.
All-time favorite meal?
All-time favorite
or
meal.
Cuisine?
Or cuisine. That's a tough one. Because I like all types of food. But all-time favorite meal. Well, jollof rice.
Ooh, there you go. What was your first job?
Toys R Us.
Wow, okay. Where would you like to retire?
When?
Where? Which city?
In an island somewhere.
Nice. With your feet up.
With my feet up.
Passenger or driver?
Driver.
Role model growing up?
Role model growing up. That's always a tough question. Who was my role model growing up?
Who did you look at first when you got into the finance world? Was there anyone?
I had nobody to look up to.
Wow.
I didn't know a single soul that worked in finance. Role model when I was growing up. That's a tough one. I mean, I would say the role models I had growing up were probably mum and dad.
Wow, that's a good one. And finally, if you had one superpower, what would it be and why?
My superpower would be to read people's minds.
Even though your superpower now is finances, but
correct. But my superpower would be to be able to read people's minds. It would make my life so much easier if I knew people's motivations and incentives before I wasted my time on things.
Love that. Thank you so much. I
Pleasure.
really appreciate it. Before we kind of close up, what do you advise people right now that are struggling, and also what maybe they can do? Because there's also some people that maybe they are sitting on a bit of money and they're lost, they don't know where to invest. There's also great opportunities right now. So just a final kind of point of view on that kind of stuff.
I think for anyone struggling, just recognize that we all go through moments of struggle. Rich people go broke, normal people go broke. It happens to everybody. I think if you're unhappy with your situation, only you can change it. Don't worry about the time it takes you to buy a house or to make money or to invest. It isn't a race. It's about your objectives and where you are in life. If it takes you until you're 45 to buy your first house, so be it, right? I think there's so much pressure to achieve things prematurely, and that's when you make the wrong financial decisions. Like I said, my goal would be that we turn the place where we're from to the place where we want to be, so that we don't raise children who are also trying to escape where we're from, right? And the way we can do that is by making the right financial decisions. And if you are sitting on money, seek professional opinions. There are financial advisors out there who can help you make sure that you're turning your cash into assets in a tax efficient way, something that works for your objective. You can do a lot of self-reading, but ultimately it's always difficult to beat somebody who's a professional at what you're trying to achieve. So seek professional opinions before you commit your money into anything serious.
Mm-hmm. And guys, make sure you follow Urban Finance on Instagram, because genuinely he's giving out so much free content that some of your favorite YouTubers are charging for. So hats off to you for that. If anyone wants to follow you, what's the best place for them?
So Instagram, Urban Financier.
We'll put it in the link as well.
Yeah, I haven't gotten around to doing a podcast or anything yet, but at some point that will come. I'm just not in the mood of starting something that I can't sustain, and you need to, not everybody can get 100,000 subscribers like Callum. So that's my aspiration, by the way. So I'm going to work on that. But no, Urban Financier, Instagram, and my blog, urbanfinancier.co.uk.
And shout out to Halfcast as well, because that's where I found you from, and I've benefited ever since. Thank you all for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this one. Honestly, like I said, we were going for the value, and I hope we achieved that. Be sure to subscribe, follow, all of that good stuff. And like I said, be sure to follow Urban Financier as well.
Thank you, bro.